Rembrandt produced more self-portraits than any other artist before him. Why he did this remains a mystery. The only real clues we have are the images themselves. He took it upon himself to do self-portrait after self-portrait in the process of getting older. It was the most undecorative idea, taking yourself and watching yourself grow old. But it gives us an animation of his life in beautiful paintings, the greatest self-portraits ever produced. He was his most available subject, casting himself in different roles throughout his life. A unique pictorial autobiography of over 70 images from his early years in the 1620s in the Dutch provincial town of Leiden, right up until his death in Amsterdam in 1669 at the age of 63. This etching was done at the very beginning of Rembrandt's career, when he was still living in Leiden, and it was done as part of a group of studies of heads. They are not really self-portraits. What he was actually trying to do was curiously studying different expressions that would be of use to him when he came to paint religious pictures. He would also put his own head onto studies of beggars, which are quite clearly studies of Rembrandt himself. Beggars in the street like this were very much part of the early 17th century Amsterdam scene of the time. They were not really seen as self-portraits back then. The concept of a self-portrait was something that came later. What we call a self-portrait would have then been called a portrait of Rembrandt, done by himself. Even in his early work, he drops himself into the paintings. For example, in this early history piece, we see Rembrandt in the back, peering in. He is 22 here, using himself to experiment with light and shade. And even in his early paintings, he is starting to understand how shade can be used to engage the viewer, which is such a key to all his portraiture. The capacity to conceal, but to make the viewer feel that you could find out more if only you looked a little bit closer. This was painted in his studio in Leiden, a couple of years before he left for Amsterdam. What we can tell from the sharpness of the shadow on the studio floor is that his studio was probably south-facing, with more intense sunlight, and he would have had to have blocked out parts of the window to control the light coming into his studio from an elevated height. In 1631, he decides to move to Amsterdam permanently, and probably the main reason for this was the important commission he received for the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, which hangs in the Mauritshuis in The Hague. This painting is considered to be one of Rembrandt's early masterpieces. At the time, he probably had a sense that he wanted to present Amsterdam with a formal image of himself, a sort of marketing image. And here we have it, in this elegant self-portrait of him wearing his new fashionable clothes. He was moving from a small provincial university town to one of the most sophisticated cosmopolitan centres in the world at the time. This is how he wanted to present himself to prospective patrons in Amsterdam. This is his calling card. Amsterdam was not like we know cities today. It would have been a much closer-knit community, with people out in the streets talking about things that were happening, and I'm sure that they would have been talking about Rembrandt. And he became very well known as an artist after Dr. Tulp's commission. And there were people who were interested in having an image of him, and paintings like this would have been made to give perhaps as a present or sell to an art lover who admired his work. He paints this remarkable self-portrait in 1633 of himself as one of the people crucifying Christ, which I think clearly signifies a strong engagement with the subject and this particular story in the Bible. By this time in his career, he was winning lucrative public and private commissions, and in 1634 he married Saskia, the daughter of a wealthy burgher, and the next year they appear together, painting himself as the prodigal son in this image, with Saskia on his knee, drinking and celebrating life. By 1639, he was one of the most successful artists in Amsterdam, and we can see from his work that he starts to veer away from portrait commissions and paints other subjects that he was interested in, biblical scenes and history paintings. This print marks this period, a rather serious look in contrast to the round-faced young man who arrived in Amsterdam 8 years earlier. This etching marks a new image of how the artist wanted to portray himself, and he returned to this same arrangement in this painting the very next year in 1640 with this incredible self-portrait. He understands that he is now an artist on a European scale, and he is trying to put himself into the great tradition of art. Amsterdam was the richest city in Europe at the time and had a flourishing art market, and he would have seen a number of Italian Renaissance paintings that had arrived in the city. In particular, he had seen this portrait by Titian, and he is trying to paint himself almost as if he was painting himself by Titian, saying, "I am the equal of the Italians, and I will sign myself like an Italian by using my first name." We are used to the artists from Italy being Leonardo or Raphael or Michelangelo, but we are not used to the artists from the north of Europe using their first names. It's Vermeer or Hals or Van Eyck. But Rembrandt signed with his first name, making the statement that he is one of the greats, just like the great Italians. In 1642, Rembrandt unveiled The Night Watch to a mixed response, and that very same year, Saskia died, leaving him with Titus, the only one of their 4 children to survive. There were problems in his personal life, but he was also increasingly facing problems artistically, and this could have been a time where he retreated from the limelight and focused more on his landscape drawings and paintings. He must have been walking through this landscape and spending more time outside of the city. But also, during this period, he produces this etching, and it's almost like we have caught him at work, and he just glances up to catch our gaze. We can see he is stripping away the pretensions of earlier self-portraits, dressed in his fine silks, and there is a much more of a focus of a simple artist engaged in his work. As a result of overspending and overborrowing, he goes bankrupt in 1656 and is forced to sell off his personal collections of art and antiques and eventually his house. As he was running into financial problems, he is finding a newfound confidence in his style of painting, using thicker impasto and looser brushwork. In this proud self-portrait, he shows himself like a king, sitting on his throne in gold robes, although in fact he was bankrupt. I feel that due to his personal difficulties, he was drinking more and more, as one thing that we can be sure of is that over time his nose does become more bulbous and his skin a more yellowy shade. Signs of alcoholism, maybe. In this self-portrait, he is only 53 years old. It hangs in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In 1663, his companion, Hendrik Stoffels, dies, and 5 years later, his only surviving son, Titus, dies. In these final years, Rembrandt produces what many consider to be his finest self-portraits. He makes the paint stand for the physical material of the face and stresses the surface of the paint to stand for his wrinkled and sagging skin and the red bulbous nose and the little scar on his left cheek that no one knows where it came from and the little tufts of hair just under his lower lip. In this painting, he changed some details as he went along, most notably in the bottom right. We can see he has his hands clasped together, but in the X-ray of the painting, his hands are sketched in slightly higher up and holding a paintbrush, showing himself in the act of painting. Clearly, the reason for suppressing this detail is so that the viewer's gaze is not distracted to the hands, but focuses on the self-examination of the face. No one really understands what is going on in this self-portrait. One of the theories is that it might be about the reference to Zeuxis, the Greek painter of antiquity, with the legend that he tried to paint the ugliest woman that he could find and eventually died laughing. That may be what is going on here, but we don't really know. This is one of his final self-portraits, and we see Rembrandt at the age of about 59 looking at us from the depths of his years and with the authority of his craft in front of two circles drawn on a wall. Why the circles? Do they represent a sketch for a map of the world? Or is Rembrandt alluding with this drawing on a brown surface to stories that say the first picture was a drawing made with a stick in sand? His eyes contain so much knowledge and melancholy that even looking at this painting on a screen, one gets the eerie feeling that Rembrandt is looking back and weighing up our failures. He was a failure when he painted this, a proud man reduced to poverty by his enthusiastic overspending. But he is also saying, art is not a business. It's a struggle with eternity. Rembrandt stands not proudly or arrogantly, but in the full consciousness of the heroic nature of his work. First, there is nothing, then there is a circle. The human hand, guided by the eye and the brain, makes a mark that only we humans can make. From the circle to this portrait is another leap, and Rembrandt has mapped himself with such craggy truthfulness that we simply stand back and look, wondering if we can ever be as real as he is. This is the final self-portrait he painted before he died on the 4th of October, 1669. Bankrupt, heartbroken, and alone, but in my opinion, the greatest artist to have ever lived.